Okay, shall we go ahead and get started, Jack?
Yeah, I think so. It's nice to see you, Jason.
Great, you as well. So I'll just start off with a quick introduction. I'm very excited to be here today. My name is Jason Gilmore, and although over the past few years in particular, I've held a variety of roles in the tech industry. First and foremost, I've been a software developer my whole life, and built a lot of web applications, a lot of consumer facing applications, things for telecom, things for the educational sector, for publishing, and so forth. And um, always, first and foremost, been a programmer and have struggled mightily with one particular part of this software development process, and that is the design side of things. So I'm really excited to be joining my friend and colleague Jack Behar on this webinar, in which we're going to introduce you to a really great tool that I think goes a long way towards solving this struggle of designing beautiful web interfaces in a way that really resonates from the coder side of things. But before I talk a little bit more about that problem, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Jack so he can introduce himself.
Thanks, Jason. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for joining us and giving us some time from what I'm sure is your busy day. My name is Jack Behar, and I am head of product here at UXPin. I've straddled the two disciplines of design and front-end development for over 20 years. So I've seen the struggles that each discipline has in communicating with each other and being able to work in an efficient manner. So I'm excited today to show you this new approach where we can hopefully use newer technology and new standards that are in place to make your lives a lot easier when it comes to design and development.
So let's take a quick moment before we proceed with the presentation to talk about this problem that I've mentioned, or this challenge, right? Over the course of the last 20 years in which I've been a professional software developer, there's never really been an issue in terms of maybe learning a new programming language or learning a new web framework, right? That's something that just reasonably takes time and effort to in which to gain proficiency. There's not really been an issue when it comes to maybe learning infrastructure or how to test your software, right? Again, these are, in many ways, these are solved problems, especially at this point in time, right? Where as software developers, we know if we invest this time, invest this effort, we're going to be able to get past these obstacles and ultimately build, test, and then deploy a web application. Well, what hasn't really been solved to date, in my opinion? What hasn't been solved is the design side of this process. And I was just reflecting on this issue yesterday with another colleague of mine, and I mentioned that looking back over the past 2 decades, I can't think of something that has personally frustrated me more than this design process, right? I know what looks good for some definition of good, right? But what I've always struggled with is designing the widget, the interface, the page that fits my definition of good. And I think to some extent, the reason why I've struggled so mightily with that is the tools that were available, the design tools, never quite corresponded with my way of thinking as a software developer, right? So quick example, yes, I do want some sort of drag and drop interface that provides me with widgets and other components. But what I also want is I want those components to be immediately available, and this is the critical part, as code, right? I don't want to design something and then be pleased with that design and then go ahead and recreate that component in code. No, I want to blur that boundary where I'm designing via some sort of interface, but then I'm extracting those designs as code. Secondarily, obviously, we often work with designers, of course. It would be nice if when you do bring in a designer, you achieve that same outcome, right? You're still able to extract those designs from whatever the designer has put together in such a way that you're not having to constantly cross this long and lonely bridge between the two disciplines, right? So because of that, because of this struggle, I'm very, very excited to hand the microphone over, if you will, to Jack to show you what sure seems to me to be the first tool that at least I've ever encountered, a tool called UX Merge that actually accomplishes this and solves that problem. So I'll hand it on over to Jack.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, for that intro. And you mentioned a bridge between design and development, and that's a great analogy. That's what Merge does. That is the use case for Merge. So we're going to get started here. I'm going to bore you guys a few minutes with slides, but then we'll jump mostly be in the tool. We're going to look at UX Pin and Merge, and then the actual use case for Merge, which will lead us to prototyping with coded components. I will build a few interfaces with a few different libraries that are already available for you right off the bat. From the right when you create a trial, you'll have full access to what I'll show you today. And then, you know what, Jason, I think I'm going to hand over that prototype to you. And I believe you have plans to integrate that with an actual application, a live application. And finally, guys, if we can get to it, we will take Q&A. If not, we promise to get back to you with answers to your questions. So if you can just drop them in chat, that would be great. And I will get to them towards the end. But for now, let's go ahead and get started here. And I'd like to introduce you to UXPin. So UXPin is the actual platform. It's a code-based, full-stack UX design and UI prototyping platform. What I mean by full stack is that you can take this app from concept and designs, from like a gray box model, all the way to code handoff. It's also got a lot of collaboration tools that integrate your workflow as a team, or it might just be a single person utilizing this tool. Either way, the tool will lend well to those two scenarios. It even handles documentation for you. It has live documentation of all your components and more. And what really sets us aside from the industry is that our software was built with code first in mind. That means that we're able to leverage features of the software to create interactions, run conditional logic, integrate design systems. And what we're here to really explore today is component-driven prototyping with Merge. So shameless slide here of some of our friends that trust their UX and UI processes with UXPin. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to the star today, which is Merge. So Merge is UXPin code to design solution. It translates UI components that have already been coded and exposes them as a library within UXPin. Now that library is visual. You're not looking at code, you're actually looking at the rendered components. It's configurable because it runs on the concept of properties. These are React libraries that we'll look at today. So every component is configurable just as you would be using that component in code. Also interactive, no more smoke and mirrors and flipping artboards. These are fully interactive components with all the behavior and functions built into them. You will have to theme, that's no doubt about it, right? Even though you're using a stock library, you're going to want to throw a layer of theming over that, and that is possible as well. And finally, it is governed. So it is governed by the design system rules that you have already determined. So no more thinking of padding and column spacing and breakpoint management. That is all handled by the design system rules that are defined. And what I like to say is that at this point, you're now using a single source of truth where you are designing with the code that you want to output. So whatever you are seeing on the screen is what you can expect to be live in your application. So as I mentioned before, there are some open source libraries that are already included. And you just have to log in and start using them. So if you're familiar with using MUI, which we'll look at extensively today, you will instantly recognize all the properties and all the processes that Material UI, MUI, has put forth in their documentation. But what's really most powerful is if you're an established company and you have your own proprietary component library, we can integrate that. So what we'll look at today with these open source libraries will be synonymous to what you can experience with your own proprietary libraries. So I'd like to take a moment to talk about the use case that has inspired Merge. And Jason, you've touched a little bit on that, the use case of bridging the gap. So in the past, without Merge, this is the world we live in. We have UX designers creating a prototype, and they hand it off to development, and development gets to build that prototype from very limited tool sets that are given to them. So I'd like to give some context to this visual. This is a visual brought forth by Brad Frost, who is the creator of Atomic Design and a big proponent on using design systems and not reinventing the wheel any longer. And what this is a fresco that was found in a small church in Spain, and it went through a restoration process. This is the concept that the head restorer had in mind. And here's what's actually hanging on the ceiling of this church. So it seems like a tragic story. However, it's put this little church on the map, and now people are flocking to see the portrait of Jesus in this way. But what's important is just to treat this as an analogy. As designers, as a designer, I have been very frustrated in the past where a lot of the detail, attention to detail, and a lot of the nuances of my designs just didn't carry through to the live environment. And that's not to knock on developers. There is a big gap of communication and skill set, and also of governance as well. So I could go hog wild in my design, but if it's just not efficient or just not doable, it doesn't make it to production. It's a huge struggle that you're probably experiencing either from if you're a technical designer or a developer. And with this other software, you are creating prototypes that simulate the experience. It's smoke and mirrors. We're flipping artboards, we're doing kind of band-aids to get the experience, to be able to communicate the experience to design developers. So with Merge, we've fixed that. We have a source of truth, which is the coded components that are now part of design systems, whether it's an open source library that you're leveraging or your own proprietary library. There are rules already in place. And those rules can be leveraged by both development and designer, or developers who are designing, and vice versa, designers who want to leverage and actually help out with the development process, right? Because you're both now using the same components, the same source of truth. Just development is going to leverage it in code, whereas UX Pen Merge is going to translate that code to the visual environment. And when you design with Merge, you will by default be creating high fidelity prototypes with all the behavior, pixel perfect parity, or you can expect pixel perfect parity of what's actually going to be published. And it's a much faster process. We're going to promote code reuse, and we're also going to make sure that we don't have product drift, essentially because we are adhering to the rules of that design system. This leads the business to making more money. And for technical designers and developers, there's harmony. We're now talking the same jargon. We are extending our skills, both as designers and developers. We're leveling up our skills to understand each other's industry a bit more. So before we jump into the tool, I just want to communicate the concept of atomic design, once again by Brad Frost. He uses chemistry this time as the metaphor here. And what I like to explain to you is that we are no longer going to be building one-off components. There will just be a single button, a single avatar, a single typography element that can then be reused and evolve into bigger experiences, right? So we start at atoms. Those are components that cannot be broken down any further, but we can combine them into a molecule. Say this is a persona card. If we bundle them together into a grouping with layout, we're gonna have an organism. And of course, we start going higher in fidelity here into templates and pages. So no more spaghetti code. We're using a single component and we're adapting that component via its properties to look and feel how we want to. And also function. It's not just about look and feel. It's also about the functionality that these components are capable of. So let me go ahead and jump into UXPen and introduce you to the tool. So here is my dashboard at UXPen. And I have a product group here for webinar. And you will see a couple of prototypes that I already created, but we're going to go ahead and create a new prototype. All right, and here is the UXPen interface. As I mentioned, UXPen is a full stack tool. So we're now going to explore everything. We're going to focus primarily on composing with coded components. Merge, UXPen merge. There's a whole classic UXPen classic aspect to this app that takes care of the use cases prior to having coded components. Think of this as your Figma use cases and such. So with UXPen, you can actually go from ideation to code. And here we're looking at the library palette. Before we go there, though, I'm going to toggle to my pages and layers. So here's where I create different pages. And I can nest those pages and create hierarchy. And then down here, you will start seeing the layers every time I drop a component in. So that concept of composition will be essentially a visual representation of that here that you can configure and change. Switching over to my libraries, I have a toggle down here which lets me choose my libraries. And merge already comes preloaded with a few of the popular libraries. MUI being the #1 downloaded React library, followed by AMP Design. And we'll also look at Tailwind CSS for those of you who are using just HTML and CSS at this point. So we'll start with MUI version 5. If you are not familiar with MUI, I'd like to introduce you to this amazing library. It has pretty much all the components you'll ever need to build your experiences. It's very scalable, themable, and you can actually spin up your own design systems using this library as the foundation. Actually, any of the libraries we'll see today as the foundation. If I go into the documentation and see all components, you can just see how many components are available. Now, these are not graphic patterns that you might be familiar with by using a Figma or Sketch. These are all components with all the functionality that is built in. So if you're using tabs, for example, the tabs will be functional. If you're using a data table, you will be able to sort, filter, do all kinds of things on that data table. These are all the components as you see documented in the library. They're all categorized just as the library to match the library's documentation. The second tab here you'll see is provided patterns. So the team at UXPen has already created most patterns that are defined in the documentation. as well as many additional patterns just to get you started. So for example, if I were to look at, say, menu, I'm sorry, that wasn't the right example here. If I wanted to, for example, look at list, you can see that we already have the few lists already configured for you. And from there, you can iterate. The last tab you'll see here is actually where you can save patterns. Once you've composed and created patterns, we can save those for later use by by other teammates or yourself, or to export as code. So let's go ahead and get started, and so I can show you the actual concept of working with coded components. I'm going to go ahead and drag a button right into my canvas, and you'll see a few things here on the props table. We have the name, the description of the component, and then a link. This link takes you back to your documentation. This is how we all stay in sync in the use of the component. If this was a private library, it would link to, say, your story book, or maybe a Gatsby site, or better yet, if you don't have any of that, we can actually do live documentation directly from UXPin. Essentially, here's how to use this component, and the concept of a React component is very simple. You have button, which is the contained code, and based on the properties that you pass it, you will get a different visual rendering of that. But it doesn't stop at visual configurations. It also extends to the behavior of the components itself. So there are many examples in each components page, which are all provided in the patterns tab. And I can also go right into the API and see the properties that the component's already capable of handling. So for example, children, that's always going to be the content of that component. We'll look at that in a bit more detail soon. But here are colors, for example, and there are some tokens that are associated with the theme. We have sizing, we have variants, which we saw earlier. If I switch over to UXPin, you'll now see those available here. And if you hover over each property, you will get a description of what each property does. So let's go ahead and customize this component a bit more. We're going to change the content of it, which is the label. We're going to select a color from the theme. So these are the tokens that are part of the MUI theme, and these can be customized, as I'll show you a bit later. So we'll select secondary. We will treat it as an outlined variant. And now you can see that we've gone from this to this, but it is the same code. It is the same package of code, just configured differently. And this is essentially how a developer would use this library's component. They were just doing it in code, not through an interface. If I switch back to my page, you'll see that I have those two buttons on my canvas, but they're single nodes. There's not much fancy here. It's just a single component. We're in this world of the atom. But let's go ahead and switch over to my library and search for a card. And I can drag that card right into the canvas, switch back to my layers, and see that card is actually a composition of different components. Card being the parent, and then these components which come as a default preset for you to get started. Once we have components exposed in this way, each component has its own set of properties. So maybe for this instance of a card, I want to show it as a video, and I can pass it a URL. Also, I have the ability to change the composition by dragging and dropping, depending on where I want that card media to be. I can also just delete and remove the things I don't want in the card. Let's simplify it a bit. And now I can, by control, and by holding down control, I can explore the tree and click right into a topography node. So let's say I want to change this to an H5 variant. And again, pass it a color, this time secondary dark. And you can start seeing how we're changing the composition, and at the same time, changing the code, as I'll show you in a bit. But also, we are not stuck with just having to use the composition as it came. I have all these components that are available. Essentially, every little piece of the UI is available for you to compose. And I can bring out this rating card for rating component, for example, and customize it, just like we did with the button. Let's say value is 3, which will initialize the button with 3 as the ranking. We can change its size, and we can also give it a max of 4 stars. So right now, this component's independent. It's just floating in the canvas. But by switching over to my layers, I can take the component and drop it right in the tree wherever I want, maybe between the 2 typography nodes. Now, let's go ahead and take this button, which we customized, and drop it in this section. We have 2 opportunities here. We can either take the button and drag it in, as we did with the rating, or we can actually select the cart actions section, and since its content is going to be children, you're going to be presented with this little target. This target allows you to select anything on the canvas, and it just drops it in there. And now I can select my button once again, and maybe since it's in a container, I'm going to set it to full width. Now that button is bound to the container. Let's show that process one more time. Go back to my library, and this time let's go into the charts category, where I can put in a bar chart. Switching back to my layers, I see that I now have typography node and then bar chart underneath. Let's take away the width, so it defaults to the size of its container. And chart now is a living component that is driven by real data. There are many different properties here that we want to explore too many of. The one that I really want to show off is the data itself. Here is, in JSON format, the actual data that is presented in the graph. And say I have 2, I just want to show 2 data points. I can just delete that, click away, and you can see it update. So whether it's a very complicated component, such as a data table, or in this case, a bar chart, it's all driven in the same way for properties. So I now have something here as an interface that I want to preview. On the top right here, I can either preview this on a device by scanning this QR code, or I can launch the preview prototype screen. And here we are. Here's our prototype. In simulate mode, I can actually use the prototype. And as you can see, the state of the component is real. I'm actually rating this. I didn't have to code any behavior or anything. It's built into the component itself. And you can now, with this concept, really test your interfaces, test all paths, not just a single concept by flipping an artboard. And of course, we have all the click behavior, we have the data, and so on. When I'm ready to hand off this code, or I'm ready to integrate the code, I can go into the spec mode, click on the component, and you will be presented with our handoff tool here. You can export the prototype. We also give you dependencies, which are all the imports that were used to create this composition. If there are any functions, for example, the state of the rating mechanism. And what's most important is all the JSX code that we need to recreate this. You'll notice that the JSX code here is clean. There is no translation. This matches exactly to the code that MUI generates. So in this case, let's show something a little more useful than just copying and pasting these sections. I can open up this prototype directly in StackBlitz. So StackBlitz is going to launch a configured React project. You're going to see the prototype as you designed it, pixel perfect, I should say, because you're using the same source of truth. You will get your functions as well as all the JSX that was necessary to create that. So, so now from here, you can either dissect this or utilize it as is. Other options allow you to download the project itself as a React project, or copy all these elements into a single clipboard. So here's a simple a simple card, right? However, I'd like to show you an actual full example of a layout, a full dashboard experience here. Remember, this is all live code, including the behaviors and also the responsive configuration that you might have done. So this layout is fully responsive. You can see the grid changing, and you can see the actual navigation changing from a temporary drawer to a persistent drawer. We also have drop downs working. We have collapses in the tools and so on. So this dashboard, you can get the spec for the full interface by clicking on it and opening in StackBlitz, and you will see the whole interface now set up here for you with all the dependencies and everything we've talked about previously. Or I might just want to get the certain elements of the page. Maybe I want to take the add bar and just export that. I can do that as well. So you can have a full interface and dissect these into separate components that are exportable to then for you to plug into your application. So that's a quick little rundown on composition. Of course, we've composed just the card, but we can extend that example to do more. I'm going to go ahead and delete all these elements. I'm going to go back to my library, and we're going to look at another library here. This time, React Bootstrap. Actually, let me show you Ant Design first. Ant Design, I really enjoy. It's actually much easier to use than MUI because a lot of the components already come composed. As before, we have our tab up here with the logo, which give us all the components that are available in the design system. But we also have the provided patterns. And in the provided patterns, we have a layout section, which actually give you full layouts to get you started. So you don't have to recreate every node here as it's laid out in the layers. But you could if you wanted to, right? This is just kind of a starting point. So I can pin this to my canvas and now set it to full width, full responsive width. And now I can actually just click inside and say I want to add another menu. I can just copy and paste that node and maybe set it as disabled. And you can now see that button as disabled. If I click here in the submenu, I could take away that icon if I wish, and I can create another submenu item and call that one item 2. You also have your properties that you need, in this case, key, ID, and so forth. And you can see we just customized this layout rather quickly without having to write a single line of code. So now we have our disabled button there, and we added a secondary item here. This layout is also responsive by nature. And all the responsive behaviors also configured by properties. So you can see the navigation collapsing and so on. But let's make this a bit more exciting. I am gonna go back into my library and then go into my layout section. In layout, I have a few components that actually help out in composing your grids and your different responsive rules and such. We're going to keep it simple and just bring out a row. If I go in my layers here, you can see that row consists of columns. And each column has the responsive behavior associated with it. So for this column, it's saying in an extra small breakpoint, it should span 24 columns. Ant Design uses a 24-column grid. So that means 24 columns will stretch the full width of its container. And in this case, it's also saying if it's small or higher, let's display it as 12 columns, as you're seeing it here, which would be half and half. So I'm going to click right into that column, go into my library, and search for a carousel component. Here's carousel. I can just drop it in and delete that first button that was in place. There's my carousel. And of course, carousel can be configured with its own properties, maybe by changing the dot position from the bottom to the left. It also has a bunch of preloaded images for you. But of course, you can substitute these images, change their properties, or even drop other content in here to create a slide. I'm going to click back on that second column. And this time, I am going to look for a typography node. So I'll just search for typography and bring in this typography node, which has children already defined in there. So of course, these are just starting points. If you don't want that title, you can take it out. Let's take out the text. Let's select title, and this time give it a level of H4. And of course, I can do the same here with this component. Maybe we'll want to show it as bold. So now I have this composition. It's fully responsive. It's got behavior built in, and I can drop it into the card by selecting the card and passing it these children. So now the whole composition that we made here is available as part of the structure of your layout. I could choose to delete this at this point, or I can set it aside to do some more UI exploration. Or I could even take this now and set it as a user pattern. What I mean by user pattern is any composition you make, you can save here, you can categorize it and create blocks that you can reuse. So maybe we'll call this hero. Now this hero will be available to any developer and designer that has access to this library. Go ahead and dump that because we won't need it right now and preview the prototype. So here's the prototype. It all works. We have submenus, we can collapse, open, and we can also see this in a responsive format. And of course, all that behavior is there. We have a preview. If you click on the image, you can actually preview it. And here is the functionality that's already built in. All the effects are driven by properties as well. So if I wanted a fade effect, I just change the property. If I don't want it to be a preview capable image, I can also unselect the preview property. So you're starting to see how these compositions are driven mostly by properties, and by stacking those in a certain way, your combinations are limitless, right? To create any prototype you really wish. Once again, I can click on spec, click on my prototype. I get all my information here, or I can open the prototype directly in Stackblitz. And all this behavior will now be shown. Of course, we're showing a small screen here, so it's giving you the responsive, smaller view. And here's all the content that you need to either migrate to your app or to start using this as the starting point of your application. All right, I'm going to dump all these guys, and we are going to show you now a library that's a bit different. In the case of Tailwind, if you're familiar, Tailwind is actually a CSS library. So it's not React components. It allows you to extend on the Tailwind classes and utilize those to lay out your properties. Okay, here we go. And you'll notice that we still have components that we provide as a starting point. We also have patterns. But you'll notice a couple of other features here that you didn't see in the other libraries. One of which is this new custom component feature. As I mentioned, Tailwind is a CSS library, and you might already have a bunch of compositions that are ready to go. Or you might want to go to the Tailwind website, where many examples are already provided. So I could go right into an example, in this case, this featured section, and they provide the code that you need. All I need to do is copy that code, bring it right in, and paste it into my component builder. And there we go. We now have that composition on my canvas, but it is not an image. This is all live code. I can, just as before, explore my layers and select any of the elements there. You'll see the classes that are being passed, and you can append to that, move, update them, change them, whatever you choose. So this will require a little bit of knowledge of the Tailwind classes, but of course they're all documented. Let me go ahead and show you something a bit exciting here for us. We have integrated AI capabilities into the platform. Currently, it's only working with Tailwind CSS, but it will be extended to all the libraries that we saw today. And how this works is it allows me to work with AI to create the layouts that I actually, to help me create those layouts. So bear with me for a second. I am going to cheat a bit and take a prompt that I had written previously to create a navigation. So we'll click on AI and paste this prompt in there. It's asking it to create a navbar navigation with gradient background, shades of blue and pink, put a store name on the left side, use uppercase letters without a logo, center align a menu, and so on. Oops. Oh, bear with me, guys.
Nothing like a live cutting edge AI
Yeah.
demo.
Yeah, right. I think Murphy's law has a multiplier as
There
well
we
when
go.
you're working with
That's
AI, right?
Second tries a
All
charm.
right. So there we go. There's my navigation. Hopefully, you can omit that and still be somewhat impressed of what it just did. In the future, we're going to also be able to iterate on this and tell it to maybe, change the tone to a more professional tone and so on. And it will start rendering that for you. All right, let's go ahead and try that one more time because I'm a glutton for punishment apparently. And this time we'll give it something a bit more complicated. We'll say, create a pricing table, 3 columns representing different pricing tiers. Column 1 will be a plan for freelancers at 19. Column 2 for startups at 39. A pricing plan for companies priced at 59. And then this column, we want it to be highlighted as most popular. Under that table, let's add a contact us for the enterprise plan. And of course, this is a little bit more defined, this prompt, so we'll give it a second here to do its thing. While it's doing its thing, imagine this working with MUI, right? And you tell it, create a store layout, 2 columns responsive, show me thumbnails of products with pricing. And it just presents that to you. And I'm not saying that's your end product, no way, right? It's always going to require tweaking and such. But you do now have it in a way that you can continue customizing. You can bring in other components from your library or from the patterns. Let's say we can go into cards and bring in button and just compose with both AI and the concepts that UXPen provides. And of course, if I were to preview this, it would work in the same way. I can spec it out. And in this case, I'm going to get HTML code since it is a CSS library. All right. I think we should do a quick live example of building, say, a login form. And as mentioned before, I'll pass it over to Jason so he can integrate it with his app. I'm going to delete all these guys again. And we are now going to select, we're going to go back to our MUI library. And now we are going to create a new layout. We're going to do this one from scratch so you can see the process. Now remember, there are many components here. We're barely scratching the surface, but let's look at some form elements. I can bring in a text field and it's fully customized. As we saw before, we can pass it a new label, a new variant, right? Maybe you want these are the variants already preloaded in MUI. We'll keep it as outlined. We'll give this the type of email. We can flag it as required, which will render the asterisk. And of course, say I already know some parameters that are needed for this form. I can pass it the ID, the name, so it's ready to go for JSON. Now we have this in the canvas, which means now we can take advantage of the tooling that UXPen offers. For example, if I wanted to copy and paste this, I could, but I could also copy a grid of those. I can then use the layout tools and such to lay that out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste another one, and let's set this one as the password field. This time we'll set it as a password type, which will render the value as asterisks. And let me just update these fields as well for password and name. All right, the next thing I'm going to need is a checkbox. I'm going to go right into my user patterns where we do have checkboxes and checkbox configurations ready for you. I'm going to select the checkbox with right label, and I'm going to pass it a different label, maybe member me. Finally, every form needs a button, so I'm going to go back to my components, drag in a button, submit, and we are going to now set this as a submit type, as a button type of submit. So we're ready. Now we have a couple of options here to lay out this form. Right now, it's just elements on a canvas. And we don't want that because we actually want a higher fidelity of code given to us. We could leave it like this and the developer could select each component, but I want to group them. So we have various options here. We can select all the elements, right click and add a Flexbox feature to it. If you're familiar with Flexbox, you can now order these as a column or as a row. You can give it a gap, change that gap, and so on. That Flexbox is kind of like a catch-all for designing the container. However, each property or each component library also offers layout components. If I go into my layout section, I can bring in a stack. And stack kind of works in the same way as Flexbox. I can show it as a row or as a column. I can change the spacing. And there are other features here as well. So now, if I wanted to bring in these components, I could just switch over to my layers and drop it right into the Flexbox. Flexbox came with a few buttons. I can delete those. And now I have all those elements in a stack. However, the stack is reversed. As you noticed, we brought in the components and they were layered in reverse order. So I could modify the order here, but also I have reverse column. And there we go. One thing I forgot to do is drop an image in there. I'm going to click on the text field and search for image. And there's my image. So the image already comes preloaded with a transition of fade, which can be changed again with the properties. We're going to go ahead and change the image itself by either passing it a URL or looking in my computer. I'm going to click on there and bring in a logo. And now I can modify the height. We'll set this as 75 pixels, the width at 100%, so it stretches the full container. And this time, the fit, we're going to change it from cover to contained. So now we have a centered logo, respecting the stack spacing. If I wanted to add more spacing, I can do 20 pixels. There we go. All right, now that I have the stack, I can even drop it into a card and continue customizing. So here's a card. I can select all the elements that I no longer want. Select my my card content section, and this time pass it this whole composition as the children. Again, I can keep this composition or dump it at this point. and I can even change the elevation of the card. We'll set it to 4. So now we have a ready to go form that can be tested with all the functionality that we need, as well as the handoff code. So you can see how it works here with the behavior that's already part of the component, such as the animation on the label and such. So we've seen composition, we've seen configuring components, we've seen some data-driven components, but we haven't seen theming yet. And I know that's what every designer's question is in mind right now. Yes, you can theme any of the libraries. We have a component here in utilities called Theme Customizer. And it's just an anchor that we can put anywhere in our canvas. I usually like to pin it up here. And what it does is it exposes the full theme that is preloaded. So this is the default theme. But of course, I can modify any of this. For example, let's go ahead and take this color as the primary main. This is a JSON Explorer where I can do that, or actually see it in raw code. And when I click away, now we have this color as the primary color. But we can take that further. Let's go ahead and change the border radius of everything. So this is a global theme and it will affect everything that we are throwing on the canvas. If I change the border here to 40 pixels, you'll see now everything will have nice rounded corners instead of what we had before. And let's now take that a little bit further by passing it a font. Any Google font can be passed by just placing the name of that font, clicking the check mark and away. And now you can see how we just updated that fully. But this is a global theme, which will affect everything you're seeing. We do have the ability to inject CSS and be able to reference them, the components. And also you have component level theming through the SX property. So for example, if I wanted to create a some CSS here of padding equals, let's do 20 pixels. I could, and only that button will be affected. So what I mean by that is if I go back to my categories and bring in another button, you can see the padding is back to default because it's taking the theme from the theme customizer at the global level. And here's an override at the component level. So let me now save this theme. You can also save the themes. In this case, we'll add it to our patterns for later use. We'll save this as rounded theme. Now, if I go to any prototype, in the case here, we're going to see a store example that is already built. This store example prototype actually has a few pages. We have your store, a product, and a checkout. And what's cool here is that we can go into our library, take that theme customizer and drop it right on the canvas, and everything just updated. So this means the use cases here are various, right? You can use your theme exploration, or if you're an agency, for example, and you have a bunch of layouts already created, you can respond to an RFP with a fully branded website, as an example. You know, from there, you can extrapolate how many use cases there can be. All the pages in this prototype are also updated. And if you want to go back to default, you can simply delete and refresh your browser, and we're back to default theme. All right, so I'm going to hand this off now to Jason. Let's go back to our form example here. I'm going to go back to edit design, and I want to send this over to Jason. I have a couple of opportunities here. I could either share it by sending him a URL. I can customize that URL to show sitemap and so on. I can password protect the URL as well if I choose. I can email to him directly or generate a QR code. In this case, I'm just going to take the URL and I will Slack it to you directly, Jason.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jack. So I've been sitting here just taking a few notes, really kind of thinking off the cuff what it is about this demo that, as a developer who, again, has struggled mightily with the design side of things over the years, like, what do I find interesting? What do I find compelling about this? Like, why do I think this could help me solve this challenge? And I thought I'd come up with 2 or 3, but I think I have just a few more than that. So just to quickly walk through this before showing you the concluding example here. One, UX Pin Merge is this visual drag and drop tool, right? But it resembles something more similar to Xcode, if you've ever done iOS development, or VS Code, than maybe Photoshop, right? It incorporates these coding related elements into it that I find familiar and frankly reassuring. 2, it supports the same CSS libraries that I use in my projects, right? These days I use Tailwind quite a bit. This also means I can copy code from an existing, maybe a third-party code gallery, right into UX Pin. 3, it Merge handles global theming, something that has frankly terrified me over the course of projects because my designs, they tend to become inconsistent over time, right? So instead I can just rely on that global theming tool to handle that for me. 4, that design is responsive, right? And again, this is another thing that I've just struggled with, right? Making sure that design is responsive as we use this design or this web application with on a mobile phone or an iPad or the desktop, of course. I can also import the design directly into my code, right? Eliminating that discussed extra step of translating the design into the code. I find it personally really interesting that I can describe what I want using this prototype AI tool. Because again, because I'm not a designer, I can't necessarily make the thing, but I know good enough when I see it. And because I know that, I can describe what I'm looking for, right? And that AI tool is going to help me do that. And then finally, and I just think this is the most important one of all, I can, as you've seen, I can quite literally copy and paste that component into my project. And what this does is it allows me to focus on that logic rather than waste a lot of time, a lot of effort, struggling to otherwise integrate that design. So what I'll do now is I'll go ahead and just share my screen. And hopefully I get the right screen right. I tend to mess this up. Do we have the right screen? Yes, we do.
Yep.
So I tend to develop web applications, SaaS applications using the Laravel framework, which is just a very popular PHP framework. Laravel is great because it comes with a lot of defaults that, whether it's on the design side of things or on the coding side of things, tends to make developers' lives easier. Authentication, form validation, layouts, configuration management, and so forth, right? So one of the defaults it comes with is a default login screen. And it works great. I mean, it's functional. I can go ahead and log in, for example, press login, and sure enough, I'm logged into this default page, right? But what if I instead want to incorporate Jack's design into this project, right? We're going to want to customize almost certainly the web application. So what I can do is I can go over to my code editor. So I'm using Visual Studio Code here, and I'm just going to delete that login page. So in the interest of simulation and avoiding Murphy's Law here, what I've done is I've basically taken that design, almost identical version to the one Jack used, and I've incorporated my logic, right? In this case, I'm using Laravel with React, with another tool called Inertia.js. And I've taken that login component and I've incorporated it into that login page. And if I go back now to the login page, you can see we have the updated widget. And the best part of all is I can still log in, right? This is such a radical and refreshing departure from other strategies, other processes I've used in the past, right? It eliminates all of that guesswork, all of that translation work, and allows me, the coder, to remain focused on the parts of the application that I can do best, which is the backend logic. So I'll go ahead and stop my screen share and hand it back over to Jack for the conclusion.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so essentially, we are creating presentational layers that are agnostic to the stack that you're using. So you can integrate that with PHP or any other ASP, any other framework. Guys, we really want to thank you for your time. We've barely scratched the surface here. There's a lot more to show, other use cases and many, many other features. So we invite you to maybe start a trial where you will have access to the libraries that we saw today and give it a go. If you have your own library and you want to now enable your team to really be efficient, contact us and we'll talk through what that involves. And with that, I think we're ready to say thank you and goodbye. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.